Now, Tim, in other discussions, you've talked a bit about the Interstate Commerce Clause. Could you tell us a bit more about that and the significance of that?
Yeah, of course I can talk about that. The Interstate Commerce Clause is one of the chief ways that the federal government has used to usurp authorities. They've taken the somewhat vague language of interstate commerce and taken that to overturn such explicit guarantees of rights as the Second Amendment. So where you got to look for Interstate Commerce Clause, what it actually meant, is you can find them in the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers, in Federalist 42, James Madison wrote a fairly lengthy article which discusses the Interstate Commerce Clause in depth, but I've got an excerpt which kind of summarizes it. And that is, a very material object of this power was the relief of states which import and export through other states from the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Now that kind of sums up a very long statement, and what it means essentially is that under the Articles of Confederation there was no interstate commerce authority for the central government, and as a result the individual states were levying tariffs against one another. So say something had to travel through Virginia to get to Kentucky. Well, actually to get to, say, Maryland. Well, what Virginia would do is they would level a tariff on the export from Virginia to Maryland. Now, the Federalists, James Madison was the one who wrote Federalist 42. He said that was untenable. We could not continue with a republic that allowed one part of the republic to fleece another part of the republic in that way. So now we have to look in other places. He clarified it a little bit more succinctly. In 1829, long after the Constitution had been passed, ratified rather, he wrote a letter to Joseph Cabell which said, "Being in the same terms with the power over foreign commerce, the same extent, if taken literally, would belong to it. Yet it is very certain that it grew out of the abuse of the power by the importing states in taxing the non-importing states, and was intended as a negative and preventative provision against injustice among the states themselves, rather than a power to be used for positive purposes of the general government." So that kind of spells it out. It was not intended to give a positive power to the federal government. It was a negative power to prevent states from embargoing or setting tariffs against one another. So now we have to contrast this with a few court cases in, well, fairly recent history compared with that. Say Wickard versus Filburn during the Great Depression. The federal government had attempting to address the Great Depression, in which they determined that farmers having problems was a big issue in the Depression. So they decided they wanted to increase grain prices to help farmers. Now, we have to lay aside the common sense that they obviously didn't have in realizing that the thing that increased grain prices, the people that's not good for is everybody, including farmers. So, anyways, what they said is when a farmer grew too much wheat in order to feed his cattle and to eat himself, and sold only what his ration was, what he was allowed to sell, they sued him and said, well, you have to plow under those additional acres that you used for your horses and yourself. He said, but I didn't sell those. Those are not only not interstate commerce, they're not commerce at all. They're just my consumption. And the Supreme Court ruled that if everybody were to do what he had done, what this farmer had done, then it would impact the price of wheat. In effect, what they said is because you grew your own wheat to eat, you didn't purchase that on the market, and thus you impacted interstate commerce. Now, obviously, that is a long ways from what Madison said. So another thing we want to contrast here is Gonzalez versus Raich, in which a person in California grew medical marijuana, which the state said was legal, but which the federal government said was illegal. Nonetheless, they said because marijuana is not going to be sold, not only won't it be sold, it's illegal to sell it outside the state of California, then you cannot claim that this is interstate commerce. And not only that, but in California at the time, you were required to grow your own pot. You were not allowed to purchase it anywhere. So not only was it not interstate commerce, it wasn't commerce at all, it was just consumption of something you grew in the garden. The federal government determined that even though it was illegal, and even though it could never be sold legally, they could still call it interstate commerce for whatever reason they decided. Anyways, so obviously the Commerce Clause has been stretched beyond all belief. For instance, for having guns near a school zone, for having gun-free school zones, they said that because students would be afraid at school if there were guns around them, and because if they were afraid at school, they wouldn't learn. And because if they didn't learn, they wouldn't be able to consume when they got older. That was interstate commerce. So obviously, there's a ridiculous understanding of the Commerce Clause within the federal government. Next we have to look at, say, Obamacare. Obamacare, which says it uses the Commerce Clause to justify their intrusion at every part of your life. I mean, really, if they're allowed to, do something just based on the cost of healthcare, then lots of things you do make you need extra healthcare. Say skydiving, or say eating fatty food, or say drinking a glass of wine, or say doing lots of things that the government could intrude and say, hey, this is going to increase how much you're going to cost us for healthcare, and thus you can't do it. So they could use the Obamacare, they could use to essentially legislate you into a state like in 1984, where the person has a TV that comes on that can see him and forces him to do calisthenics, where they get only so much food, and where the government gets to determine every single aspect of your life, period, even what you think. So you have to look at that and decide if that's what we want to do. Now, then you also need to look at what commerce was at the time of the founding. So commerce at the time of the founding included only sale across state lines from an individual in one state to an individual in another state, or from one state to a person outside that state, actually transporting goods into a port, receiving things via ship. So it never ever meant all gainful activity. It never meant agriculture or farming. It never meant those things. The federal government kind of invented that to allow them to do these things. So with those things in mind, we at the 10th Amendment Center have introduced a few things. One is a Firearms Freedom Act. Now, we have one of these in Oregon. The Oregon's Firearms Freedom Act was introduced by Kim Thatcher last semester. Now, it didn't get a hearing. If you want Firearms Freedom Act to get a hearing, you need to call your legislator, your senator, your representative in the State House and ask them to co-sponsor and demand that they give it a hearing.
Tim, could you go over what a Firearms Freedom Act is again, please?
Okay, so the Firearms Freedom Act, as I mentioned, the federal government uses the Commerce Clause as an excuse to legislate on firearms. So if you think about that, the Commerce Clause is somewhat vague, and they're using it in no way that it was intended. And the Second Amendment is very clear. Second Amendment says that shall not be infringed, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So what the Firearms Freedom Act is it kind of skirts the Commerce Clause. It says specifically if a firearm is made within one state, sold within that state, and retained within that state, and it has a made in that state sticker or impression on it, then it can be sold without regard to any federal legislation, any federal regulations, or any federal taxes. And I believe that that is maybe the first step. And really, to be honest, that's not even a nullification, because it's still playing by the federal government's books. It's still playing by the rule book that the federal government set up. That is, that commerce, any selling of any part of a gun across state lines is interstate commerce. Now, it's not, but we're trying to get our foot in the door. Once we get this, maybe we can take it a step further. Also, the Intrastate Commerce Act. And what the Intrastate Commerce Act is a more general version of the Firearms Freedom Act. It says any object, any grain, anything that is bought or sold within the same state, retained within the same state, and produced entirely within the same state is off limits to federal regulation.